What's going on, guys? This is Tower number 9. This is another video with Endless Night, testing out some more unusual decks. So I'm playing a variation on the on the Sabine Killer Iden that I showed on the channel previously. So this is my deck, which is currently called, I believe it's called Sabine Killer 2, Kill Sabine Harder. So very teched for the aggro matchup, and also trying to hopefully remain competitive in longer games. We'll see whether or not I achieved that. So I'm going to be playing this Command Iden against my opponent Endless, a friend from the Star Wars Legion community, newer to this game, but has been diving in, and he is playing a blue Jyn build. Also maybe teching for aggro a bit there with a 30 HP base. I think we've really seen an interesting evolution of the meta such that it is here on TTS. The early on in the game, I think the 25 HP bases were often considered just generally better, but things have really shifted, and we've seen a much more aggro meta in the current scenario. And as a result of that, um, we've settled into this time where the 30 HP bases they seem quite reasonable. And I'm not sure. I'm hoping aggro doesn't end up being as like central as it is right now, even though there are counters to it and so on. It seems like right now things are quite fast. Um, I'm going to play Inferno 4 here. When played or when defeated, look at the top two cards of your deck. You may put them on the top or bottom in any order. So very strong, efficient card. I see a Consortium Star Viper, which is an anti-aggro tech card. That's going to go to the bottom of the deck. I drew one earlier and resourced it. That's something that's meant to deal with those. It's meant to deal with those units like the early Alliance X-Wings, the Green Squadron A-Wings, Red 3, cards like that. That's what the Consortium Star Viper is to deal with. Sometimes with the Energy Conversion Lab, and the restore helps too. And Endless unfortunately misses his turn one play. Um, not how you most want to start things off, but I'll take it. To get back to my earlier point, though, I hope that aggro ends up being somewhat less prevalent in later on, or at least that we see stronger options for mid-range builds. So like Luke is traditionally kind of mid-range, but I've honestly been really struggling to get a command Luke build that can deal with aggro. It seems really difficult. And it seems like even with a lot of card slots teched for the matchup, it's still really a struggle. So I'm hoping that we're going to see some better counters in the future. And we'll have to see what shows up or what doesn't. I think that it's very likely that we're going to see some more stuff that helps against aggro, but the the current meta seems to be fairly skewed in that direction, which is why we have decks, going to the 30 HP bases, running Consortium Star Viper in main deck, doing other stuff like that, just to try and shore up those matchups and have a good situation if you run up against that Cunning Sabine or against that, Aggression Leia, so-called Christmas Leia. If you check out the Christmas special from the channel earlier. There, I accidentally flip up my cards instead of exhausting them. So last turn I played Admiral Piet, and I'm going to use a tie advanced to buff Piet. Surprisingly, my opponent didn't actually have a play last turn either, which is kind of funny. I was sort of hoping that he would play something that I could counter with the Death Trooper that I have in hand, but given that he didn't have a play, it ended up being a situation where I had a relatively low value play myself. Um, so my opponent brings in Agent Callus, or I'm sorry, not Agent Callus. He brings in Kanan Jarrus, who will be able to do some damage and heal the base. And I'm currently just focused on pushing damage to the opposing base. So one thing that I think it might have been a good idea. So Piet here is buffed by the tie advanced, so he actually has 6 HP. It might have been reasonable for me to attack Callus with Piet, and then I can use the Death Trooper to defeat, or I said Callus again, to attack Kanan with Piet, and then use the Death Trooper to defeat Kanan if need be. Um, might have been better. But in this case, my opponent attacks first, using Jin's ability to reduce my unit's power by 1. So Jyn Urso's ability on the leader side is the action you may attack with a unit and reduce the defender's power by one, which is really very solid for just taking efficient trades, getting those slightly better interactions. So in that situation, the fact that my opponent used that ability meant that I had to trade using Piet to do 3 damage. If he had not had Jin and had made that attack, I could have followed up by simply playing out that Death Trooper doing the 2 damage there, and that would actually get would get Jin off the board. Or I'm sorry, that would get Callus. I said Callus again. That would get Kanan off the board, and I would be able to continue. My opponent has did not play something there. Has a huge number of cards. I bring in Iden. After my opponent plays a restored Arc, my opponent deploys Jin. I'm going to take out Jin with a maximum firepower here. So maximum firepower deals damage to a unit equal to the power of an Imperial unit you control, and then you do that same thing again with a different Imperial unit. So I deal 4 from Iden and 3 from the TIE Advance, defeating Jin as soon as she arrives. On her leader side, Jin is a 4/7 that constantly reduces the power of enemy units when you're attacking by one. So basically the same sort of effect as her leader side ability, except it's a passive, so it's on all the time. You don't have to exhaust her to use it. That means that it also works with things like ambush, which otherwise kind of don't quite fit synergistically in. However, even though I was able to defeat Jin very quickly, my opponent has a counter for Iden, a takedown. And because Iden has only 4 HP, takedown actually defeats her through her shield. So Iden's off the board, and I do think my opponent could have gained an advantage by playing that takedown before deploying Jin. Then I wouldn't actually have been able to take out Jin with my maximum firepower because I would not have had a 4 to go with my 3 to add up to 7. I could have only done 5 damage with my 2 ties there. I trade my tie advanced for my opponent's restored arc 170, and we're going to continue. I have some AT-STs in hand, some nice solid units. My opponent, however, brings out Luke Skywalker Jedi Knight, defeating Inferno 4. Inferno 4's ability does go off when defeated, allowing me to look at my top 2 cards and send them to the top or bottom. We're going to leave the TIE Advanced on top and send the Regional Governor to the bottom here. Okay, so Luke has a bunch of HP. I'm going to try to put an obstacle in his way. First, I deploy General Veers, who's a 3/3. I know that my opponent doesn't have any resources left, so it's probably just going to take the initiative at this point. So Veers is a 3/3 that gives other Imperial units +1/+1. He is also an official, and then I'm going to bring out the Emperor's Royal Guard, a 3/4 that gets Sentinel if there is an official in play or if I control an official. So Veers is not only giving that Royal Guard +1/+1, making it a 4/5, but he's also granting Sentinel. My opponent spends 6 resources, bringing out Obi-Wan Kenobi. Bit annoying there. I really don't want to clear Obi-Wan while Luke is on the board, because Obi-Wan can then give Luke +2/+2 and draw a card. So we'll have to see what my best option is. I do have an overwhelming barrage here, so it seems like maybe a good option is going to be to try and buff up my Royal Guard further and then go for a big barrage. I could also bring in the AT-ST, so I could ambush an AT-ST and immediately defeat Obi-Wan, but then he gets to buff Luke. Instead, what we're going to do is bring in the TIE Advanced, and we're going to give +2/+2 to the Royal Guard. So now it's actually a 6/7 with the experience tokens and Veers' buff both in effect. Sorry about that, guys. Had a little cough there. So now the Emperor's Royal Guard at 6/7 is 6/7 Sentinel is equal in stats to the mighty Luke Skywalker. And hopefully that's going to allow me to hopefully that is going to allow me to hold off this area for another turn. So here my opponent swings in with Luke. The Royal Guard takes 6 damage, but is still alive thanks to the buffs. However, Luke does manage to heal the enemy base for 3, which is not what I most want to see. Not a lot I can do about that though, and because Luke did take that damage, I'm going to be able to play the Overwhelming Barrage. It's going to do, I believe, 8 damage, and then I can do 2 of that to Luke to defeat him. Or no, I think maybe it's only 6 damage. Let's see. No, I have 6 strength, so it should be 8 damage. So I'll do 2 to Luke, 6 to Obi-Wan, and clear them both out. And Obi-Wan's ability does give 2 experience counters to the restored arc, which is annoying but can't really be helped. However, I can potentially answer it with a takedown next turn. The +2/+2 on my Emperor's Royal Guard from that Overwhelming Barrage is also going to allow me to do a mighty 8 damage to the base. I'm really now one downside is my opponent has a ton of resources and more cards than me. We see the Millennium Falcon show up. I'm gonna have Veers swing in for another 3 damage. And if my opponent were on the 25 HP base, this would actually be lethal right now. My opponent plays a Wing Leader, and I was originally going to buff the Falcon, but I point out that the Falcon is not a rebel. Ends up getting a further +2 to the restored arc instead. I'm going to take the initiative. I have another barrage, so I'm feeling pretty good about this situation. A surprise strike from the Falcon does 6 damage to my base. My opponent does have a strong space arena, but with the my opponent does have a strong space arena, but with the overwhelming barrage that I have available, I can potentially clear out. So doing 8 damage, I could potentially clear out both the Falcon and the buffed arc in one go, and then still have resources available. And the +2 power will also allow me to push through and close out the game more quickly. So let's see how this goes. I'm indeed going to do that barrage. We're going to clear the restored arc. We're going to clear the Falcon, and at this point, I'm sort of hoping my opponent doesn't have like a takedown or a vanquish to deal with the Royal Guard. Plays out Yoda, which is not going to do it, I think. So I can now have my Royal Guard swing in 8 damage to the base, and unless my opponent has an immediate counter for Veers, he can actually attack and close out the game. We could also, of course, see some healing, so we could see like Repair. So Repair is, in my opinion, not a very good card, but in the current very aggro meta, I think there's some reason to consider running it just because it heals your base quite cheaply, and you may not be able to use all your cards against aggro anyway. But that's probably more of a sideboard card. Um, depends on what you're thinking, maybe, but I think it's probably more of a sideboard card. So now we're going to move on to the next. We're going to move on to the next round. And I was victorious in game one. Looking at the sideboard a bit, my opponent did not actually have a sideboard specified for this deck because it was so experimental. So I don't sideboard myself. I do have cards that I would sideboard in for this matchup to go for kind of more of my. So my default configuration for this deck is kind of anti-aggro, but I have cards that I can sideboard in to go for a long game configuration. I'm just not going to do that because it's yeah, it's a bit unfair for one player to sideboard and the other player not to not have it. So we're not gonna have any sideboarding at this time. Although under normal circumstances, I would be moving more towards my long game configuration. Bringing in some ramp cards, bringing in some more end game units, removing stuff like the Consortium Star Viper, which is an anti-aggro counter that I don't need in this matchup. My opponent plays the Crafty Smuggler, 2-cost 2/2 with Shielded. Unlike the previous game, does have a decent initial play. I'm going to go ahead and play. So the Viper Probe Droid would be easily defeated by that smuggler. I'm going to play the Regional Governor. When played, name a card. Well, this is in play. Opponents can't play the named card, and I believe I named Millennium Falcon here. Um, my reasoning is pretty straightforward. The Falcon is a annoying obstacle, or it's an annoying rush type card in the early game. I want to ensure that that's not going to make its appearance. Now, note that I had a Viper Probe Droid. I could have played the Viper Probe Droid, seen his hand, and then used the Governor to like more effectively target a card that I knew that he had. The problem with that is the Viper Probe Droid trades very unfavorably with this Smuggler, so it's better, I think, not to play it to avoid incurring that disadvantage. My opponent then plays a Jedi lightsaber on the Smuggler, which I do not like to see. So Smuggler now up to a 5/5. Um, at this point, I play a Death Trooper. I'm going to deal 2 damage to my own Governor, which is a less important unit, and 2 damage to knock the shield off of his crafty Smuggler. I would have normally played the Emperor's Royal Guard here to put a Sentinel on the board. But given that my opponent had the shield and now had the buff, that would have actually traded quite unfavorably. So my opponent swings in for 5 aggressive start here, but luckily for me, I draw a takedown. That's actually just what I want here. It's going to be able to clear out that smuggler with lightsaber, and actually, even if he had still had his shield, it still would have been able to clear him out. So takedown, definitely a card that I'm excited to see in this situation. Otherwise, I could have gone for the Emperor's Royal Guard and traded it and the Death Trooper for the smuggler. But I am much happier to just get the direct defeat effect, get the smuggler off the field, and still have my Death Trooper. There is a 3/3. 3/3 is a little below the curve. So I would say right now the curve for ground units, a 3 cost unit, should be 3/4. 7 points of stats, we'll say. The 4/3 Echo-based Defender is also a reasonable card. But 7 points of stats. Um, so cards that are 3/3 or 2/4 for 3 are actually below the curve. That doesn't mean that they're bad. They can be good if they have strong abilities to make up for it. So we see like Fleet Lieutenant is very widely played despite being below the curve. Um, cards like Fifth Brother is a quite reasonable card despite being below the curve. He has easy ways to make up for it with his abilities. But if you're playing a unit where a large part of it is just like having those stats and fighting the opponent with your stats, more so than your ability, 3/3 is not really a good place to be in. You're going to want to be larger than that. So, like Veers here is 3/3, but he has a really good ability buffing other friendly Imperial units. +1/+1, pretty solid. The Emperor's Royal Guard that I have in hand is on curve at 3/4 and also has a strong ability with the conditional Sentinel and can even become a 3/5, which is really efficient if you control Emperor Palpatine as a leader unit. And that's actually something that I think is going to be really strong once Emperor Palpatine leader comes out, because playing a 3-cost 3/5 is really good, plus you have quite relevant abilities. So I brought out Veers and pushed damage to the base with my now buffed units, whereas my opponent brought out a um, pair of restored Arc 170s. So those restored arcs are, in my opinion, really strong. I actually quite like them. They're efficient, efficient little fighters. They can do some substantial damage in the right circumstances. And I'm going to bring out the Emperor's Royal Guard here, getting a little bit of defense for my ground arena. I do want to deploy Iden this turn, but I'm wary of a takedown. However, I have a very funny little plan here, which is I've actually drawn another regional governor. And we're going to bring out this regional governor and say takedown. So now my opponent can't play the Falcon and can't play takedown here on the turn when I'm going to deploy Iden. And that's going to just buy me some extra security. My ground arena is feeling really strong now. My opponent does bring out Obi-Wan Kenobi. Don't love to see him. He's a powerful and annoying opponent. I deploy Iden. My opponent deploys Jyn Urso. Jyn, of course, would have to attack that Royal Guard. I am going to, so if I want to attack in the ground arena, I have to try and push through Obi-Wan Kenobi. But I can actually do that fairly efficiently. I have my regional governor that was blocking the Falcon swing on in, dealing 2 damage thanks to the buff from General Veers. And I could now defeat Obi-Wan with Iden. Iden would only lose her shield, and that would be the dangerous Obi-Wan Kenobi off the board. My opponent swings in with Jyn, inflicting 4 damage to the Emperor's Royal Guard, but he stays alive thanks to the buff from General Veers, doing 3 damage back. It would be 4, but Jyn's passive prevents 1 damage. Iden goes ahead and takes out Obi-Wan. We see 2 experience on Jyn, so she is now 9 HP and has suffered 3 damage, so 6 HP remaining. At this point, I could defeat her with I could have both my Death Trooper and Veers attack into Jyn and defeat her. But that would involve losing a fair amount of board. Under the circumstances, it seems to make more sense to go for the base. I have some answers. I could ambush her with an ATST. I could play the overwhelming barrage. I have some definite answers for Jyn. So I don't really want to trade multiple units into her. I also have that Emperor's Royal Guard still alive, protecting the ground arena from a direct attack. One note, though, is that if Veers is defeated, the Royal Guard will also be defeated because it's only being kept alive by the +1/+1/+1 from Veers, and that temporary HP will go away if Veers is off the board. So if my opponent has a takedown or something and clears Veers, it could be a nice 2-for-1. Nice for my opponent, that is, not for me. I'm going to have the Royal Guard go ahead and attack into the base. I'm kind of thinking about putting pressure on the base here. My opponent continues to attack me with his restored arcs, which are both doing some damage and doing some healing. Now, I could ambush Jyn with the ATST, which would defeat her. I could overwhelming barrage her with Iden, which would also defeat her. If she attacks into my Royal Guard, I can defeat her with other stuff. She does end up attacking into the Royal Guard. So Jyn has now taken 6 damage, does have the 2 points of experience, so that brings her defense up a little bit, but she only has 3 life remaining. I'm going to go ahead and keep attacking the base though, rather than trying to take out my opponent's units, because I am seeing that I am close to getting the win here. I could clear that base with just 5 more damage, which I do actually have on board. And now my opponent is going to bring out a powerful, I believe it's a Luke Skywalker Jedi Knight. Yep, that's right. Luke Skywalker Jedi Knight shows up and uses his -3/-3 to clear General Veers. Um, so this is actually a situation, we discussed this after the game. This is a situation where I think my opponent somewhat misplayed it. So Luke Skywalker Jedi Knight gives -3/-3 to a unit when played, and -6/-6 if you've had a unit defeated this turn. So what my opponent was doing here is trying to bait me into defeating a unit so that he could then use ability in order to do the -6/-6 instead of the -3/-3. But what I believe J-Rod, who was observing, pointed out was that my opponent could have led off by deploying Jedi Luke just using the -3/-3, but that -3/-3 would have been enough to defeat Luke, or I'm sorry, Veers. And then having defeated Veers, my Royal Guard would also be defeated because it would lose that temporary HP in the interaction that I mentioned earlier. So that would have been a really good initial play. I think it would have been more efficient than how this ended up. So here, I ATST ambush to take out Jyn, doing a little bit of damage to the base as well with Overwhelm, and then I'm attacking the base, but I don't quite get there. I've done 29 damage, and the base has 30 HP. Will my opponent be able to recover? So we could see, I'm not entirely sure what would do it. The problem here is that I have some pretty powerful units. So even an attack with Luke that clears one of my units and heals for 3 wouldn't quite be enough. My opponent decides to go out in a blaze of glory here with a surprise strike into my base, doing a lot of damage and healing his base for 3. but Iden or the ATST can still just attack the rebel base and clear things out, and that's indeed what happens with my ATST attacking and destroying Jyn's base. So this was a victory for the Sabine Killer Iden. After the fact, we discuss it, and indeed, my regional governor had saved Iden from an untimely demise there by blocking a takedown that my opponent had indeed been holding. Maybe waiting to try to get that high value takedown on the leader, pierce the shield that we saw in the first game. But ultimately, it was not to be. Regional governor paid off. I think the earlier governor actually also blocked a falcon that my opponent ended up resourcing. So a lot of value from the regional governors this game. And here we're just sort of going over this situation with, I believe, J-Rod pointing out that the Luke Jedi Knight to eliminate Veers would have been a strong play. Yeah, overall, interesting game here. I think Iden felt able to hang here, even though it was not a super aggro deck, and my deck is kind of teched for aggro. The second game was a lot closer than the first, I think, though. And I do think that if the game had been extended even further, it's possible that my opponent's more powerful endgame units, like that Luke Skywalker Jedi Knight, I don't know if he's running Han Solo Reluctant Hero, who's really good also. But there are definitely some cards that my opponent could be playing that would give me some trouble in the late game. Luckily for me, we did manage to close things out before those larger units could give me too much trouble. I don't have a lot of endgame in this deck, at least not pre-sideboard. I do have some bigger units in the sideboard, but they're not immediately available. But the top of the curve right now is that ATST. All right, that's going to do it for this one, guys. Thanks to you all for watching. Some some interesting games with kind of experimental decks here between Endless and myself, and ultimately, I'm honestly a big fan of Iden. I think Iden is pretty real. We're gonna have to see what happens, but I think Iden is a pretty real deck and is potentially well suited for this aggro meta. Though we'll have to see. I need to do some more intense testing against like Leanne Sabine, make sure that she can actually hang with it. I know that the Sabine killer test earlier was successful for Iden, but there could be more to that in the future. Um, More testing to be done, making sure that like this variant of it hasn't lost some of the secret sauce or whatever, and see where things go from there. All right, thanks to you guys for watching. I'm going to put my deck list in the video description below, and we'll be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content. I will catch you guys later.